Hi to all my favorite kindergartners in Mrs. Stemn's class. This is Miss Goist. You probably remember me from last year mystery reader, and I'm in your classroom a lot taking pictures. So I'm so happy that we still got the chance to do mystery reader, and this time I'm doing it from home. And I know last time I was in your class to read a book, I told you about my two dogs, and now you get to see them. So let's see. Ooh, that's Loretta, and this one is Quincy. They're both a little camera shy, so they're just going to sit behind me really quietly, they promised, while I'm reading the book, Grace for President. And the reason I chose this book is because right now we're in the midst of primary season, which is when we voters go to the polls and cast our ballot to who we want to run for president. And so your parents and I did that earlier this month. We voted in the primary, and come November, we'll be voting in the presidential election. So I thought it'd be fun to learn a little bit about that. And also, if you remember, I am a quilter. I make quilts, like the one on the couch right there. I made that one. And so many years ago, when my daughter was about your age, she wanted to be president. And so I started to make her a quilt to give her that had all the presidents on there. And I haven't finished it yet, but I wanted to show you the pieces of it so you can kind of see. And someday I promise I'll finish it and bring it in to show you. But in the meantime, I'm going to read Grace for President by Kelly DiPuccio and Loen Pham. One Monday morning in September, Mrs. Barrington rolled out a big poster with all the presidents' pictures on it. Grace Campbell could not believe her eyes. Gotta get a picture of Grace here. Woo! Nope, still don't have her. There she is. Where are the girls? That's a very good question, said Mrs. Barrington. The truth is, our country has never had a woman president. No girl president ever? Grace asked. No, I'm afraid not, said Mrs. Barrington. Grace sat at her desk and stewed. No girls? Who'd ever heard of such a crazy thing? Finally, she raised her hand. Yes, Grace? I've been thinking it over, and I'd like to be president. Several students in the class laughed. Well, I think that's a star-spangled idea, Grace, said Mrs. Barrington. In fact, we can have our own election right here at Woodrow Wilson Elementary. The snickering in the room stopped. Grace smiled. Would anyone else like to run for president? Mrs. Barrington asked the class. Nobody raised their hand. Becoming president was going to be easy, Grace thought. The next day, Mrs. Barrington made an announcement. In the name of democracy, I have invited Mr. Waller's class to join our election. Their class has nominated Thomas Cobb to be their presidential candidate. Grace's heart sank. Thomas was the school spelling bee champion. His experiments always took blue ribbon at the science fair, and he was captain of the soccer team. Becoming president wasn't going to be so easy after all, Grace thought. The teachers put the names of all 50 states and the District of Columbia in a hat. Everyone except for Grace and Thomas got to take a state. I'm Texas, said Anthony. I'm New Hampshire, said Rose. I'm Michigan, said Robbie. What does the number 17 mean? Each state is assigned a number of electoral votes. That number is determined by how many people live in that state, said Mrs. Barrington. Each of you will be representative of your state. Altogether, our country has 538 electoral votes, Mr. Waller explained. On Election Day, the candidate who receives 270 electoral votes or more wins the election. Why 270? Asked Rose. That's more than half of all the electoral votes, Mr. Waller said. Becoming president really wasn't going to be so easy, Grace thought. Grace came up with a campaign slogan. Make history. Vote Grace Campbell for president. Thomas came up with his own campaign slogan. Vote for Thomas Cobb, the best man for the job. Grace listened to what issues were important to the students, and she made a list of campaign promises. A peaceful school, no bullies. A cleaner school, no littering. Better hot lunches, no more fish stick tacos. Thomas made up his own list of promises. Free tutoring, free soccer lessons, fish stick tacos every week. Grace made campaign posters and buttons. Thomas made posters and buttons too. Each week, the teachers set aside time for the candidates to meet with their constituents. Polls were taken, voters were making their choices. Grace continued to campaign. At recess, she gave speeches. During lunch, she handed out free cupcakes. After school, she held rallies. Meanwhile, Thomas wasn't worried. He had cleverly calculated that the boys held slightly more electoral votes than the girls. At recess, Thomas studied his spelling words. During lunch, he worked on his latest science experiment. After school, he played soccer. Even before the election, Grace made good on her promises. She joined the safety squad. She organized a school beautification committee, and she volunteered her time in the school cafeteria. In early November, Woodrow Wilson Elementary hosted a special Election Day assembly. Grace and Thomas took their places on stage, and the school band began to play. Henry was the first representative to approach the microphone. The Yellowhammer State of Alabama casts its 9 electoral votes for Thomas Cobb. The Last Frontier State of Alaska casts its 3 electoral votes for the best man for the job, Thomas Cobb, Fletcher said. Hannah called out, the Grand Canyon State of Arizona cast its 10 electoral votes for Grace Campbell. And so it went. State after state cast their electoral votes. The scoreboard in the gymnasium kept track of the totals. The voting demonstration was quickly coming to an end. Clara approached the podium. The Badger State of Wisconsin cast its 10 votes for my best friend, Grace Campbell. Grace looked at the scoreboard. Thomas had 268 electoral votes. She had 267. There was only one state still unaccounted for. Wyoming. Thomas grinned. Grace felt sick. He looked at Thomas. He looked at Grace. He looked down at Grace's handmade flag. What are you waiting for? Thomas whispered. The band stopped playing. All eyes were on Wyoming. Finally, Sam cleared his throat. The Equality State of Wyoming cast its 3 electoral votes for Grace Campbell. The gymnasium erupted in loud cheers and a few boos. Mrs. Barrington approached the podium. With 270 electoral votes, the winner is Grace Campbell. Thomas looked stunned. Grace hugged Sam. Why did you do it? She asked. Sam handed Grace his flag. Because, he said, I thought you were the best person for the job. The following week, the students in Mrs. Barrington's class were preparing for their career day presentations. Grace volunteered to go first. She stood in front of the room and glanced at the poster still hanging on the wall. My name is Grace Campbell, and when I grow up, I'm going to be the President of the United States. And this time, everyone believed she would. So I hope you like that. So now I'm going to show you a little bit of the quilt I'm making eventually. So maybe you guys will recognize who this is. Do you know who that is? Is that our first president, George Washington? You probably know him from the dollar bill, right? How about this guy? You know that? That is Abraham Lincoln, and you might recognize him from the $5 bill. And this one might be a little harder, but he was mentioned in the book. Do you remember what school the kids went to? Does that help at all? They went to Woodrow Wilson Elementary School, and that is Woodrow Wilson. So those are all the ones I'm going to show you. I actually have all the presidents, through the second George Bush, because that was when I started the quilt, which tells you how long it's been. It's been a long time since I started the quilt. But I'm going to show you one more thing that is going in the quilt. This is going to go in the center of the quilt. Can you see that? Can you see the eagle? That is the presidential seal. And if you were ever in the Oval Office, which is where the president works, that's his office, on the floor is a carpet that has the presidential seal, just like that. So anyway, one of these days I will finish that quilt, I promise. It's funny, my daughter Amelia doesn't want to be president anymore. She wants to run a museum, which is fine, that's great. But someday I will finish that quilt and I will bring it in to show you. So I hope you had fun. I think we put the dogs to sleep here. They're kind of snoring away. Look at that. But I think they've enjoyed joining us for this, and I will see you real soon. Great. Have a great day.